Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue now to talk about the role of framing and risk communication. And you might recall that we concluded by thinking about what makes frames effective. And now what I want to do is talk a little bit about framing and risk communication in pandemics. So recall from our earlier discussion of collective action that health behaviors in a pandemic may require personal sacrifice. And I'm sure that all of you are already familiar with this. Can't necessarily do the things you would like to do. You may have to wear a mask, which is, I can tell you, not necessarily the most comfortable thing in the world. And your lives change in ways that require personal sacrifice more generally. That is the C in this collective action equation, right? The cost of taking cooperative pro-social behavior. Now, there are many different ways we might think about inspiring or encouraging that behavior. Today, we're going to just talk about risk communication, and we're going to ask the question, how do you message about a pandemic in ways that invite that kind of behavior? What kind of messages or narratives, given the part of this subject for this part of the class, do you put out there to encourage that kind of behavior? And there are two basic schools of thought on this. There is a classical sort of economic perspective that suggests that it's hard for people to conceptualize their contribution to risk in the world, and that really the way that you message to people to encourage them to engage in this behavior is to emphasize risk to themselves, right? That D term in the equation, the selective incentive, you can enhance that by emphasizing that if you take pro-social cooperative behavior, you'll protect yourself from risk. That has been challenged, that perspective has been challenged in recent years by research in psychology and behavioral economics. This suggests that people often underemphasize the risk that they themselves feel. Right? People take risky behaviors all the time, and people may even undervalue or underweight the scale of risk that they engage in. And that people might actually be more receptive to information that highlights their role in spreading risk in the community, that they might feel more worried about, for example, passing the virus to other people than they are about getting it themselves. So you might think about the first perspective, the classical economic perspective, as the personal frame, and the second perspective as the pro-social or public frame. And so what we can do is look at experimental social scientific evidence to see which of these frames people are more receptive to in the sense of changing their public health behaviors. So there's a recent study by a group at Harvard and MIT that did a survey experiment with people. And what they did was they randomly assigned online respondents to one of three flyers, to see one of three flyers. And then what they did was ask about their intention to engage in social distancing behavior. There's an index of that, as well as their perceptions of the personal and public threat of COVID-19. And the three treatments were this. The first treatment was a personal treatment. So if you notice that poster right on the left, it says, follow these steps to avoid getting coronavirus. Okay, so the only thing that's changing across these posters is the verb that we're using there. So it's avoid getting coronavirus. In the second, the public treatment or the pro-social treatment, they're saying avoid, follow these steps to avoid spreading coronavirus. So getting is about yourself, spreading it is about the public or the community. And then the final treatment is combining those two frames. Follow these steps to avoid getting and spreading coronavirus. And so what the researchers here were interested in is which of these three frames was most successful in getting people to increase their intentions to engage in social distancing behavior. Now, I want to note here, there's a limitation of this study, which is that we're really just looking at what people say they are going to do. Now, that doesn't always match up with what people do in the world, but it might provide an indication of what people are likely to do. So let's see what they found. So what they found, so there's a control condition where they're not receiving information about the poster. There's the personal condition. Next to that, the public or pro-social treatment. And then finally, the personal public treatment. And what they found is if you look at the mean or the average level of prevention intention, which is a scale that goes from 0 to 100, is that the highest average prevention intention was in the public or pro-social treatment group. In other words, when people got the message about take these steps to avoid spreading the coronavirus, they were much more likely to, or significantly more likely to report a higher level of intention to engage in prevention activities, masking, social distancing, and the like. It was significantly higher than the level of prevention intention in the personal treatment, telling people that they should follow these steps to avoid getting COVID-19, and as well as the personal and public sort of combined treatment. So this suggests that when people receive information about the effects that their behavior has in the world, it actually can change the way that they behave, because they might not want to be responsible for spreading the virus. Now, that's not the only content in the frame, right? We receive messages all the time that are not just about how our behaviors affect our own health risks or affect things in the world. We receive other kinds of information too, information about trade-offs between public health behaviors and other kinds of behaviors. So there's another experiment that I think is informative here on that when we're talking about framing and what kind of information we give to people. This is an experiment conducted by Aaron Dislat at Indiana University Bloomington. And what Dislat does here is test the effectiveness of public health versus economic frames on social distancing intention on the same sort of scale. And people will receive sort of vignettes about the virus, and then they receive one of two randomly assigned treatments. The first treatment is an economic issue frame, and it says this: if citizens generally choose to shop more, it's less likely that employers and workers will be as financially hurt by reduced consumer spending. Given this information, which option are you likely to choose? Ask them about social distancing intention. So we're just giving them information there about the economic effects of social distancing. And in the second treatment, we're saying if citizens generally choose to shop less and practice greater social distancing, it's likely that hospitals will be more able to handle COVID-19 cases and fewer citizens will die. Given this information, which option are you likely to choose? So it's a public health frame. Different than the economic, we're giving them different kinds of information about the effects of their actions. And the results of this experiment may not be surprising to you, but they are informative about the way that the information that we provide can affect people's self-reported intentions to engage in behavior. So preference for social distancing among people randomly assigned to the economic frame was 69.1% of those participants chose to engage in or reported they would engage in social distancing. And in the public health frame, it increased significantly to 79.9% of those respondents said they would engage in social distancing. Now, again, the result here might not be too surprising. When people receive information about public health versus the economic effects of their decision, they're more likely to report that they would engage in social distancing. But what this highlights is that it's not just the way that we talk about public health when we frame things that matters. It's also about what else is included in the messages that people receive. It's not just the case that when people hear about COVID-19, they're hearing about the public health side of it, they're also hearing about the other effects it has in the world, and that can change their reported desire to engage in certain kinds of behaviors. So framing really matters, but what is included matters a great deal. Now I'll note that not all frames inspire greater adherence to public health behaviors. And in particular, when frames cue something called motivated reasoning, they can cut against the goals of public health. What do I mean by motivated reasoning? This is a term that emerges from cognitive science, and it's a phenomenon in which individuals base their decisions on goals, desires, or prior beliefs, rather than evidence about the situation at hand. And if you think you don't engage in motivated reasoning, I have bad news for you. We all do to some extent, because our understanding of situation can be very influenced by the desires or goals or beliefs that we hold. For example, smokers often engage in motivated reasoning when they dispel scientific evidence to suggest that smoking is bad for one's health, right? So often in studies of motivated reasoning, one of the sort of disturbing findings is that simply providing people with more information about the effects of, say, smoking on your health is not enough to persuade people to change their behavior, especially if you have been a smoker for a long time and it is sort of entrenched habitual behavior, and especially if you're not in a community of people who don't smoke. It can be very difficult to get you to change your behavior, and simply providing people with more evidence about its effects is not necessarily going to get people to change, because we engage in motivated reasoning. And motivated reasoning can occur for a variety of reasons, because we have a variety of goals and things that we care about that might shape our behavior. And when it comes to novel public health events like a pandemic, the kinds of things that affect our behavior are not just our personal experiences with health, but they might be things in the world that relate to politics or political conflict. So novel health issues tend to breed motivated reasoning, and I want to give you a very clear example of this. Back in 2006, there was a vaccine introduced for something called human papillomavirus. And there was a controversy over both immunizations for HPV in general, as well as vaccination mandates, particularly for middle school aged girls. No sooner had the vaccine been introduced, but there was a real competition in state governments, among doctors, pharmaceutical companies, religious groups, parents, as well as the two major parties to define the issue, right? And they wanted different things out of the controversy. They held different beliefs, and there was a lot of conflict going on in the states about this issue. Because it was a novel issue, there wasn't a lot of information out there prior to the existence of the issue. The conflict really affected the way that people thought about it. And there's a really good survey experiment by the political scientist Sarah Gollust at University of Minnesota and her co-authors. And what they did was they exposed their subjects to two different informational treatments. In the one treatment, people were exposed to a series of news reports that suggested that people were generally in agreement that this was an important public health measure that people should take. And in the other treatment, people got conflicting news reports, illustrating this sort of political controversy over this new vaccine. And what Gollust and her co-authors found was that if you were exposed to information about the controversy rather than the sort of consensus over the effects of the vaccine, you're significantly less likely to support vaccination and immunization than if you're exposed to news briefs reflecting uniform support for the legislation, as you can see in these bar graphs here, the mean support for school vaccination and immunization decreases in that group that received the treatment about the controversy. So the point here is that when we have a new health issue about which there's not a lot of information, we can use our prior beliefs, especially when there's a controversy, to inform our health behaviors, even when that might not necessarily be the safest thing for us or really reflect the true threat level in our environment. And this is certainly the case when it comes to COVID-19. Now, overall, the trends across people of different party identifications sort of move in the same direction. Right? Between April and June, people of every partisan stripe reported an increase in their propensity to wear masks. And this is from Gallup. In the past 7 days, how often have you worn a mask on your face when outside the home? That increases among people of all self-identified parties over the course of the spring. However, you'll notice that there's a big partisan gap. And that's in part because of the cues that partisan elites are sending out. People are receiving very different cues from the political leaders that they trust the most. And so it's not necessarily surprising that you're seeing at least a reported gap in behavior. And you see the same thing on social distancing. There's a little bit of a decay in reported social distancing, but there's a huge partisan gap across the board when you look at people's reported behavior. And so it's really important to think about the way that politics affects the way that we reason about health risks. And there's some really good evidence that can help us think through this. And one way of thinking about this is that motivated reasoning doesn't just affect us, the public, it also affects elites. So if you look across the early months of the pandemic, Republican Democratic governors engaged in very, very different policies related to imposing mandates on social distancing, closing certain sections of the economy. And that's in part related to motivations they have for portraying the virus in a particular way or portraying their party's management of the virus in a particular way. But it's not just because of party. When you have a strong motivation or goal, regardless of what party you're a member of, that can affect the way that you engage in public health behavior, or in the case of political elites, behavior related to the policies they put in place. So this is from an analysis I did a few months ago, which shows that even when you control for the spread of COVID-19, right, you hold that constant across the states, and even when you control for the party identification of the governor, states were more likely to reopen early if they relied heavily on income taxes for revenue. So this graph shows that for Democratic governors, states with Democratic governors, if you relied only for 5% of your state revenue on income taxes, you were about 25% likely to reopen your economy in July. If you relied 20% on income taxes for state revenue, your probability of reopening in July was about 75%. And the reason for this was not just partisanship, although you do see a partisan gap. It's because when states relied on income tax more heavily for revenue than compared to property tax or sales tax, and they shuttered their economies, it meant that they lost a lot of tax receipts very, very quickly, right? And that can make it very difficult to run state government. And so there was a huge incentive for states to reopen, perhaps even too soon, simply to keep the lights on in government, and because there wasn't a lot of support, fiscal support from Congress for doing that. And this is true for a variety of institutions, not just state and local governments, but all kinds of civic and social institutions that rely on revenue that comes from people actually being there to keep the lights on. And even though people might have the best of intentions, sometimes what they're able to do in the world, or what their sort of economic motivations are, might cut against what is a good public health strategy or behavior. So motivated reasoning really isn't just about party identification. It's about any strongly held sort of motivation or goal that might cut against, in this case, public health, or what we know to be true as effective public health strategies. However, and this is the bright side on which I'm going to leave you in this lecture, motivated reasoning isn't a foregone conclusion. And we challenge motivated reasoning all the time, so it's possible. And I want to illustrate this by talking about this Twitter experiment that was done by researchers at the University of Pittsburgh. So back in May, these researchers assigned 400 participants randomly to read a series of 4 tweets and then ask them about their social distancing intentions. Now, they knew that party identification and self-reported ideology is one reason why you see differences in social distancing behavior. So in the control condition, they gave people a series of tweets and told them they were recently posted by an American government official, didn't tell them who it was, didn't tell them what party they were a member of. And in the tweets, the official uses science and data to support the call for social distancing. In the treatment condition, people were told that the tweets were recently posted by Republican Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio. And again, in the tweets, the governor uses science and data to support the call for social distancing. So just to give you a sense of what this looked like, in the treatment, people received the tweet plus the picture of the person who tweeted it. In the control condition, they didn't receive information about the person who tweeted it. And what they found was that in the control condition, you saw a big ideological difference in social distancing intentions. Self-identified conservatives were about 13% less likely to report social distancing intentions in the control group. But when you had DeWine as the author of the tweets in the treatment group, you don't see a difference. Social distancing intention looks about the same across those two self-identified sort of political designations. So the implication here is when we think about addressing motivated reasoning and appealing to people with public health messages, what matters is not just the message that we send out, whether or not we're talking about effects to yourself or the public or the economy versus public health. What matters in part is the messenger, right? If people see a message that is not from a person they identify with or a trusted messenger, somebody that they feel has their best interests at heart, right? In this case, a member of the same party, or maybe somebody you perceive to be of the same similar belief system, it can be very difficult to move people's behavior. But addressing motivated reasoning depends not only on the message, but whether or not the audience trusts the messenger. And so when we're thinking about framing, we want to be sure that we're not only messaging in a way that's going to appeal to people, but as back in the case of Magnuson that we saw earlier, whether or not that audience is getting a trusted messenger along with that message. So to just wrap up, to go all the way back to the beginning, pandemics create collective action problems, right? And these are things that political scientists really are at the core of what we study. How do we ensure that large numbers of people engage in cooperative behavior? And in general, we try to deal with that by reducing the cost of collective action or increasing people's sense of duty to take cooperative pro-social behavior. Risk communication is one way that we try to do that. And effective risk communication, among other things, can lower the cost of collective action, can make it easier for us to understand what we have to do in order to reduce the spread of the virus. And it can also increase our sense of duty to act collectively, our sense that it's up to us to stop the spread. not all frames are effective at appealing to people, right? The way that we frame our messages matters. And we can have more effective frames when we include anchoring appeals. Right? We're not just telling people, trust the science. We're actually appealing to values that our audience holds, right? And bringing in, bridging in elements of the environment that matter to them. And we're using trusted messengers, right? We're using people that our audience trusts to tell them about what they should do. And finally, we're using clear causal stories in our frames. We're telling people what the outcome will be if they don't take a particular action, and the outcome if they do. During COVID-19, pro-social and public health frames have been shown to enhance health behavior. So in other words, we're telling people about their effects on their community, and when we're focusing on public health, that can enhance people's health behavior. Of course, people don't always get those frames, and in part because the way that politics surrounds novel health events like COVID-19, motivated reasoning can creep in, right? We believe frames that come only perhaps from our set of trusted sources. Now that is not necessarily inevitable, right? It is possible to challenge motivated reasoning, for example, by ensuring that when an audience receives a message, it's coming from a trusted source, right? And that can correct false beliefs, and it can also induce public health behavior. But not all frames are going to be equally able to do that. So the point here is that motivated reasoning isn't a foregone conclusion, and that the way that we frame and pose public health messages can have an effect on whether or not that's the way that people make sense of what they should do during a pandemic. So this is the end of the lecture, and now you can complete the last series of quiz questions, 7 through 10. And I will see you when we have the next section of the course on COVID's origins. So I look forward to seeing you again then, and hope you look forward to Dr. Platek's lecture next week.